When the adult rhino finally lowered its massive head and allowed Peter's small hands to touch its horn, the entire zoo audience fell into absolute silence. Even the director, who had spent the last 15 minutes yelling orders for the boy to stay away from the fence, stopped talking. But to understand how we arrived at this impossible moment, we need to go back 3 weeks, when 10-year-old Peter Miller first stepped into the city zoo of New Haven with his class from the public school in the Liberty Heights neighborhood. Peter was the kind of child who goes unnoticed in a crowd, too thin for his age, in clothes clearly handed down from older siblings. He carried in his dark eyes a seriousness that didn't match his 10 years. The son of a housekeeper and a janitor, Peter had known the harshness of life from an early age, but he had also learned something that many children his age didn't yet know. True empathy is born from one's own pain. While his classmates ran around excitedly screaming at the monkeys and taking selfies with the flamingos, Peter walked slowly through the zoo, observing each animal with an almost reverent attention. It was when he reached the rhino enclosure that something changed within him. There were two animals in the space, an adult female grazing peacefully and a solitary male who remained motionless in the farthest corner of the enclosure. The animal seemed sad. Peter couldn't explain how he could recognize sadness in a creature so different from him, but that's exactly what he saw. The rhino kept its head down, not because it was eating or resting, but as if carrying an invisible weight. Why does he stay alone there? Peter asked the tour guide, a young man named Ricardo, who had noticed the boy's peculiar interest. This was changed to "Why is he all alone over there?" to reflect more natural English speech. "Oh, that's Brutus," Ricardo replied, adjusting the baseball cap with the zoo's logo. "He arrived here 2 years ago, from a circus that was shut down. Since then, he hasn't been able to adjust properly. He's kind of aggressive." "Aggressive how?" Ricardo hesitated, looking around to make sure none of the other teachers were listening. "He doesn't let anyone get near him, not even the handlers. When someone tries to get close, he charges the fence. The vet says it's trauma from his time in the circus." Peter nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on the rhino. There was something about the animal's posture that was familiar to him, the same tension he recognized in himself when he arrived at a new school mid-year, or when he had to present projects in front of the class. The same defensive loneliness. When the field trip ended and the school buses departed, Peter couldn't get Brutus out of his head. That night, lying in the small room he shared with 2 brothers, he dreamt of the rhino, but in the dream, the animal wasn't sad. It was free, running across an endless savanna. The next day, Peter did something that surprised even his mother, Mary. He asked to use the money he had saved for months selling candy at school to return to the zoo. "But you were there yesterday, son," she said, without taking her eyes off the pile of clothes she was folding on the small living room sofa. "I know, Mom, but I need to see something." Mary stopped what she was doing and looked at her son. She knew that tone of voice. It was the same one Peter used when he had made an important decision. At 10 years old, he already demonstrated a determination that sometimes frightened her and sometimes filled her with pride. "Okay, but you're going alone and you're coming back before dark." At the zoo, Peter went straight to the rhino enclosure. Brutus was in the same spot as the day before, motionless, isolated. Peter bought an orange juice from a nearby stand and sat on the bench in front of the enclosure, simply watching. He stayed there for 2 hours. On his third visit to the zoo, one of the ticket booth employees, Carmen, an older woman with gray hair and a kind smile, recognized him. "Hey kid, weren't you the one from the school that was here last week?" "Yes, ma'am, and you're back again." Peter nodded, slightly embarrassed. "I wanted to see the rhinos." Carmen smiled. "Oh really? Which one? Hope is beautiful, isn't she?" "Actually, it's Brutus." Carmen's smile faded slightly. "That animal is complicated, kid. You'd better stay away." "Why does everyone say bad things about him?" The question came out stronger than Peter intended. Carmen looked at him with renewed curiosity. "It's not that we say bad things, dear. It's that he's dangerous. He's tried to attack several people." "But why? What did they do to him?" Carmen sighed, looking around the empty ticket booth. "Sit here," she said, indicating a chair beside her. "I'll tell you something, And that's how Peter learned the true story of Brutus. The rhino had spent 10 years of his life in a traveling circus, confined to a tiny space, forced to perform humiliating tricks for audiences who applauded his submission. When the circus was finally shut down for animal abuse, Brutus arrived at the zoo as an adult, traumatized and unable to trust any human being. Dr. Henry, our head veterinarian, says it may take years for him to recover. If he ever recovers, Carmen concluded, with sadness in her voice. Peter absorbed every word. When he got up to leave, his eyes held a determination that Carmen had never seen in a child. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Carmen." "You're welcome, dear. But do you promise you'll be careful around that animal?" "I promise." But the promises of 10-year-olds don't always mean what adults think they mean. The following week, Peter established a routine. Every day after school, he took 2 buses to the city zoo of New Haven. He sat on the same bench, in the same position, and stayed there for at least an hour, simply observing Brutus. Sometimes he brought a book, sometimes he just sat in silence, but he was always there. At first the rhinoceros didn't seem to notice his presence, but gradually, Peter noticed small changes. Brutus started lifting his head when the boy arrived. After a few days, he began to position himself so he could see Peter while grazing. It was almost imperceptible progress, but Peter noticed it. It was Ricardo, the tour guide, who first noticed what was happening. "Man, have you noticed?" he said to Carmen during their lunch break. "That kid who comes here every day, Brutus, acts different when he's around." "Different how?" "Calmer. Yesterday I saw him even approach the fence when the boy was there." Carmen frowned. "That can't be good. What if the beast decides to attack?" But Ricardo shook his head. "I don't know. There's something different. It's like they understand each other." The real change began the second week. Peter had noticed that Brutus always got more agitated during peak hours at the zoo. The loud voices, the children's screams, the constant noise seemed to make him even more withdrawn. That's when Peter had an idea. He started arriving earlier, before the official opening to the public. He talked to Carmen and got special permission to enter during the quieter hours, when only the staff were present, and it was on one of those quiet mornings that something extraordinary happened. Peter was sitting on the bench, as always, when he noticed that Brutus had approached the fence closer than ever before. The rhinoceros was watching him curiously, its head slightly tilted. Slowly, without any sudden movements, Peter got up from the bench and took a few steps toward the fence. Brutus didn't retreat. Peter stopped about 2 meters from the fence and sat on the ground, cross-legged. And then he did something no adult would do. He started talking. "Hi, Brutus. I know you don't like people very much. I didn't like them much either before." The boy's voice was low, almost a whisper, but full of a sincerity that seemed to vibrate in the morning air. "My mom says I'm kind of like you, that I keep to myself when there are strangers around. She says it's because we've moved so many times, and I've always been the new kid." Brutus took another step toward the fence. "You've been forced to do things you didn't want to, right?" "Me too. When my dad lost his job last year, I had to sell candy at school to help out at home. At first I was ashamed. The rich kids in my class would look at me like I was different." Peter paused, observing the rhinoceros, which was now just a few meters away, separated only by the bars. "But you know what I learned? That it's not our fault when people don't understand who we are. Sometimes they're scared, sometimes they just don't know how to get close." It was at that moment that Brutus did something no one had seen in the 2 years since his arrival. He approached the fence completely and lowered his head to Peter's level. The two stood there, boy and rhinoceros, looking at each other through the iron bars, in a moment of connection that defied any logical explanation. "I'll keep coming here," Peter whispered, "every day, until you know that there's at least one person in this world who understands you." From that day on, Brutus's transformation became impossible to ignore. The zoo employees began to notice that the animal was more active, more interested in what was happening around him. More importantly, he stopped charging at the handlers when they approached to clean the enclosure or bring food. Dr. Henry, the head veterinarian, was intrigued. A 50-year-old man with decades of experience working with traumatized animals, he had never seen such a radical behavioral change in such a short period. That's when he learned about Peter. "There's a boy who comes here every day to see Brutus," Carmen told him. "Since he started coming, the animal has been different." Dr. Henry decided to observe for himself. The next morning, he arrived at the zoo early and hid behind a tree near the rhinoceros enclosure. What he saw left him speechless. Peter was sitting on the ground, as always, but this time Brutus had extended his head through the bars, allowing the boy to gently touch his snout. The two remained like that for several minutes, in a silent connection that seemed to transcend the barrier between species. Dr. Henry knew he was witnessing something rare. In all his years of career, he had seen few examples of such a genuine bond between humans and injured animals. There was something about the boy, a special quality that Brutus recognized and trusted. That afternoon, Dr. Henry talked to Peter for the first time. "You're the boy who comes to visit Brutus, aren't you?" Peter, who was drinking water at a water fountain near the enclosure, turned around, slightly nervous. Adults asking about his behavior usually meant trouble. "Yes, sir. Did I do something wrong?" Dr. Henry smiled. "On the contrary, you did something very right. Can you tell me how you managed to get so close to him?" Peter thought for a moment. "I don't know how to explain it exactly. It's just, I think we're a little alike." "How so?" "We've both been hurt by people who should have taken care of us, and we've both learned that it's safer to be alone." The simplicity of the answer hit Dr. Henry like a punch to the gut. This 10-year-old boy had identified in a few words what he, with all his academic training, had taken months to diagnose. "And how are you two coping with this?" "We're learning that not everyone is the same, that there are people who genuinely want to help." Dr. Henry nodded slowly. "Peter, may I ask you something? Would you like to help Brutus in an official capacity?" The boy's eyes lit up. "How?" "Well, we have a program here at the zoo called Young Keepers. It's usually for older teenagers, but I think we could make an exception in your case." That's how Peter became the youngest participant in the zoo's volunteer program. 3 times a week, after school, he not only visited Brutus, but also helped the keepers with simple tasks, preparing food, cleaning equipment, and noting observations about the animal's behavior. But his most important function was to be the bridge between Brutus and the human world. Whenever the rhinoceros seemed agitated or stressed, Peter was called. His simple presence had a calming effect that no medication could replicate. Brutus's transformation became evident to everyone. The animal that once lived, isolated in a corner of the enclosure, now explored all the available space. He began to interact with the female, Hope, and even to show curiosity about the visitors. But it was 3 weeks after their first meeting that the unexpected happened. It was a sunny Saturday, and the zoo was full of families. Peter was in the enclosure making his notes when a group of businessmen on a technical visit approached, accompanied by the zoo director, Mr. Augustus. Augustus was a middle-aged man, always impeccably dressed, who ran the zoo as if it were a regular company. To him, the animals were mainly numbers in cost-benefit spreadsheets. He had little patience for what he called sentimentalism regarding problematic animals. "This is our most challenging rhinoceros," he was explaining to the businessmen, gesticulating dramatically. "He's cost a fortune in medication and special care. Frankly, we're considering transferring him to another institution." Peter felt his stomach clench. Transferring Brutus would mean separating them forever. "Challenging how?" asked one of the businessmen, a man in an expensive suit with a cynical expression. "Aggressive, antisocial, impossible to handle. Just look." Mr. Augustus approached the enclosure's fence and banged his hand on the iron bar. "Hey, big guy. Come here." Brutus, who had learned to associate loud voices and abrupt gestures with danger, immediately recoiled and assumed a defensive posture. "See, 2 years of treatment, and he's still like this. Completely useless from an educational standpoint." Peter couldn't contain himself. He got up from the bench where he was making his notes and approached the group. "Excuse me, sir," he said, addressing the director. Mr. Augustus turned, annoyed by the interruption. "Who are you, boy? Don't you see we're in an important meeting?" "I'm Peter Miller, a volunteer in the Young Keepers program, and I need to say that you're wrong about Brutus." A murmur of surprise ran through the group of businessmen. A child confronting the zoo director was something no one expected to see. Augustus turned red. "Wrong how? You're just a child. You don't understand how things work here." "Yes, I do, sir. And I know that Brutus isn't aggressive or useless. He just needs someone who tries to understand him, instead of wanting him to be something he's not." And then, to everyone's surprise, Peter walked toward the enclosure. Brutus, who had hidden in the back of the space when Mr. Augustus shouted, immediately approached the fence upon seeing the boy. "Peter, get out of there now," shouted Mr. Augustus. "It's dangerous." But Peter didn't move. Instead, he reached out his hand through the bars. And Brutus, in front of all those incredulous adults, lowered his massive head and gently touched his horn to the boy's palm. The silence that followed was absolute. And this is the moment where our story began, where Peter proved that genuine connection can overcome years of trauma and mistrust. One of the businessmen, an older man with gray hair, was the first to speak. "In 30 years of visiting institutions like this, I've never seen anything like it." Dr. Henry, who had rushed over upon hearing the commotion, stood beside the group, watching the scene with a smile on his face. "This boy," he said, "has taught us more about animal rehabilitation in a few weeks than we've learned in years of study." Mr. Augustus, still red with anger and embarrassment, tried to regain control of the situation. That's just a trick. It proves nothing." Peter turned to look at him, his hand still touching Brutus. "It's not a trick, sir. It's trust, and you don't get trust by shouting or hitting. You get it by showing that you truly care."
There.
The boy's words echoed in the morning air like a lesson everyone there needed to hear. One of the businessmen pulled out his cell phone and began recording the scene. Within minutes, the video would be circulating on social media, taking the story of Peter and Brutus to thousands of people. Mr. Augustus realized he had lost control of the narrative. In a matter of minutes, what he intended to use as an example of a problem had turned into a public demonstration of his own lack of sensitivity. "Well," he said, trying to regain his dignity, "perhaps we were hasty in our assessment." Peter moved away from Brutus and walked back to the group. When he stopped in front of Mr. Augustus, his words were measured, but laden with a wisdom that surprised everyone. "Sir, Brutus isn't a problem to be solved. He's a living being who deserves respect and care. If you can't see that, maybe the problem isn't his." The sentence hung in the air like a thunderbolt. The businessmen exchanged glances, some clearly impressed by the boy's courage and eloquence. Dr. Henry could barely contain his pride. It was at that moment that 2 people arrived who would completely change the course of events. A local TV journalist, who had been tipped off about something interesting happening at the zoo, and Mary, Peter's mother, who had come looking for her son after not finding him at home. "Peter," Mary shouted, running towards the group, "what's going on here?" The journalist, a young woman named Anna, immediately realized she was witnessing a special story. She began filming as Peter explained what had happened to his mother. "Mom, they wanted to send Brutus away just because he's different." Mary looked at her son, then at the rhinoceros, who remained near the fence, as if waiting for the boy's return. In her eyes, you could see the moment she fully understood what had happened. "My son," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "you did the right thing." Mr. Augustus, realizing that the presence of the press made the situation even more delicate, attempted a last maneuver. "Well, of course, we never actually intended to transfer the animal. It was just a theoretical discussion, but Anna, experienced in detecting damage control attempts, didn't let it pass." "Mr. Director, could you then explain to us what the zoo's official policy is for animals that have difficulty adapting?" The question put Mr. Augustus in an impossible position. Any answer he gave would be compared to his previous statements, which had been heard by several people. It was Dr. Henry who saved the situation, but not in the way Mr. Augustus expected. "Our policy," he said, looking directly into the camera, "is to treat each animal as a unique individual, with its own needs and traumas, and thanks to young people like Peter, we're learning that patience and empathy are more effective than any other treatment." The interview Anna conducted with Peter that day went viral. The video of the 10-year-old boy, speaking with impressive eloquence and wisdom about empathy, respect, and second chances, was shared millions of times. But the real impact of Peter's story went far beyond social media. In the following weeks, the zoo received thousands of visitors who came specifically to meet Peter and Brutus. Donations began pouring in from all over the country, not just money, but time and expertise. Veterinarians specializing in animal trauma volunteered their services. Child psychologists proposed studies on children's ability to connect with injured animals. More importantly, Mr. Augustus was discreetly transferred to an administrative position where he would have less direct contact with animal care. In his place, Dr. Sandra, a veterinarian who had worked on the front lines for years and understood that running a zoo meant much more than managing numbers, was promoted. Peter continued his volunteer work, but now with a special status. The Peter program was created, an initiative that trained children and teenagers from low-income communities to work with traumatized animals. If you've made it this far in this story, it probably touched your heart the same way it touched the hearts of millions around the world. Stories like this, which remind us of the importance of empathy and genuine connection, deserve to be shared. If you'd like to continue receiving reports like this, which celebrate humanity's ability to transform lives through compassion, be sure to follow our upcoming content. 6 months after that memorable Saturday, Brutus had completely transformed. Not only had he developed a healthy relationship with Hope, which resulted in the zoo's first rhinoceros pregnancy in over a decade, but he also became one of the most popular animals among visitors. Children from schools all over the city came to meet Peter's rhinoceros, and many of them left inspired to pursue careers related to animal care. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation happened to Peter himself. The shy boy who used to go unnoticed had found his voice and his mission. At 11 years old, he was already lecturing in schools about empathy and animal care. He had been invited to television programs and even to a meeting with the governor of the state. However, Peter never lost his humility or his connection to his origins. He continued to live in the same small house in Liberty Heights, helping his mother with chores and selling sweets at school when necessary. What changed, he said, in an interview a year after the events that made him famous, wasn't who I am, but how I use who I am to help others. And Brutus had learned that not all humans were a threat, that some people, especially one in particular, could be trusted, that the world, despite sometimes being cruel, could also be kind. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, exactly 1 year after that life-changing moment of connection, Peter was sitting on the familiar bench in front of the rhinoceros enclosure. Brutus approached the fence
as he always did when he saw the boy arrive. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him walked a small, clumsy calf, his son with Hope, born 3 months earlier. "Hi, Brutus," Peter whispered, extending his hand through the fence. "Do you want to introduce me to your son?" And then, in a way that no one could have predicted, Brutus gently nudged the calf toward the fence, allowing Peter to touch the little rhinoceros for the first time. It was a full-circle moment. The animal that had been hurt by the human world now trusted enough to introduce its offspring to the boy who had restored his faith in kindness. Dr. Henry, observing the scene from afar, smiled as he made notes on his clipboard. On Brutus's chart, where he had previously written traumatized, aggressive, prognosis guarded, there was now a new notation, fully rehabilitated, a miracle of human connection. But Peter knew it hadn't been a miracle. It had been something much simpler and much more powerful. Two wounded souls, who recognized each other, and decided to heal one another. That afternoon, as Peter prepared to leave, as he had done every day for over a year, he said goodbye to Brutus, with the same words he'd spoken on the first day. "I'll be back tomorrow, okay? Until you know there's at least one person in this world who understands you." But now, for the first time, Peter knew Brutus already knew that. And more importantly, Peter had also learned that there were many people in the world who understood him. As he walked toward the zoo exit, Peter carried with him a lesson he would take for the rest of his life, that the greatest transformative force in the world is not violence, not power, not money, it's empathy. It's the ability to see beyond appearances, to recognize the pain of another as a reflection of our own pain, and to reach out, literally or figuratively, to say, "I understand you, and you're not alone." This lesson had transformed a traumatized rhinoceros into a proud father. It had transformed a shy boy into a defender of the voiceless, and it had transformed an entire zoo into a place where healing was possible. Because sometimes, when the world seems too harsh, when people seem to have lost the ability to care for one another, a 10-year-old child emerges to remind us that kindness still exists, and that it can still move mountains, or at least win the heart of a 2-ton rhinoceros. On the rhinoceros enclosure sign, below the technical information about the species, there was now a small but powerful sentence: "This exhibit is dedicated to Peter Miller and all young people who teach us that empathy is the strongest bridge between different worlds." And every morning, as the sun rose over the zoo, and Brutus emerged from his den to graze beside Hope and the calf, he would look toward the bench where Peter used to sit and flick his tail slightly, as if saying thank you. And Peter, even when not physically present, felt that gratitude in his heart, because he had learned that when you save someone with love, you also save yourself. The story of Peter and Brutus became legend at the zoo, but more than that, it became a daily reminder that real transformation happens when we stop trying to change others to fit our expectations, and begin to love them exactly as they are. And in a world that sometimes forgets the importance of kindness, this lesson resonates like an echo of hope, whispering that there's always time for a second chance, always room for healing, and always power in the simple decision to reach out to those in need. That's how a boy from humble beginnings taught an entire zoo, a city, and eventually the world, that the greatest possible revolution isn't made with shouts or force, it's made with a whisper: "I understand you." And sometimes, just sometimes, that's all someone needs to hear to find their way back to life.